Unfortunately, Chancellor Merkel, a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago now, came out and said that she did not intend to put it in simple terms, impose a ban on Communist Party of China-backed 5G systems being deployed in Germany. Chancellor Merkel doubled down on that statement and just in very recent days said again that she would not be imposing a ban. And this is interesting because it's in spite of the fact that very publicly, even her foreign minister and members of her security services have let it be known very clearly that they think that that is a big mistake and that there should be a de facto ban on Huawei 5G tech and Communist Party of China-backed 5G technology being deployed in Germany. Of course, there's a problem. The problem is that Germany held its 5G license auctions, which is a mistaken policy, but they did that earlier this year. And the carriers, the mobile carriers that bought those licenses, Deutsche Telekom and various others, they started deploying Huawei 5G technology regardless of any government decision. Exactly the same thing has been happening in the UK. So the UK, there is still this debate about whether or not the UK will ban Huawei. The thing has got so ridiculous that you even have the CEO of Huawei in an interview saying that he thinks Washington's going to be disappointed with the UK's decision when they make it. I mean, Huawei in their Twitter account are openly taunting the United States and the West, saying there's nothing you can do to stop us. They were flaunting just this past weekend Angela Merkel's statement again that she won't reverse this. The reinforcement of the decision made in Hungary to allow Huawei to deploy. And then, of course, the facts on the ground that are being created, which is that these mobile carriers, which Beijing has used as their Trojan horses to get this equipment deployed, that these carriers are doing this anyway, regardless of whatever decision their governments may make down the road. What they're trying to do is make it impossible for politicians to say you can't deploy, because they're going to say, well, we've done it. We've done it now. Do you want us to turn off 5G and remove all of this equipment and annoy all of these people, our customers? So they're trying to make it politically impossible to even make such a decision, which I have to say is a tactically brilliant strategy by the people that came up with it in Beijing or wherever else they were. The UK and Germany don't look good, except I would say that it's not lost. It is not lost insofar as that none of the carriers that are making national security decisions for their governments without consulting their governments or waiting for their government's decisions, none of those companies can be assured that the decision will go the right way for them, and therefore they and their shareholders should anticipate the risk of a rip and replace order. And if I was the shareholder of one of those companies, or I was on the board of one of those companies, and I saw that the CEO of my company and the management teams of my companies were proceeding with these deployments, taking on these obligations, and doing so without waiting for the decision of the government, I think those board members and those shareholders should be calling in those CEOs and asking, what the hell do you think you're doing? What happens if, so let me give you a scenario. There's another Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong. And the street, voters in the West get very agitated about that, which they will, because they do care. And there is huge public pressure all of a sudden to do something. The easiest, fastest thing to do will be to put in place these bans on Huawei that should have been in place already anyway. So you do that. And now you're a company like Deutsche Telekom or EE in the UK or wherever, who's been deploying all of this Huawei 5G equipment for the last many, many months, and you've got it all out there, and now you're going to get an order to rip it all out. Where are you going to be left standing? You think you're going to be able to come back to the taxpayer and say, give us the money back? Or we've lost millions and hundreds of millions deploying all of this equipment? Okay, maybe Huawei is vendor financing it and they're doing it at their own risk. And that if there is a rip order, that they've accepted the risk of absorbing that loss. Maybe that's the case. And I kind of expect it might be. But if it is, we should know that. And by the way, you should let your governments know that right now. No secret deals with these guys. Nothing behind the scenes. But if it isn't the case that Huawei is going to absorb the loss and your shareholders are going to absorb the loss, I would suggest that you're not acting responsibly when you are deploying without your government having made a final decision. Because the final decision hasn't even yet been made in Germany. It certainly hasn't been made in the UK. Coming back to Macron, President Macron, in an interview with The Economist magazine, if you look at the details section of the interview, and this is a big step forward because it's the first time that a major Western leader has acknowledged exactly what's going on. President Macron said that they have effectively outsourced vital national security decisions to mobile telephone companies who have no interest whatsoever in national security and only care about making money. And that's a big acknowledgement by President Macron. It's not something that he was saying insofar as that it should just apply to France. It was actually made in a much more wide-ranging interview in terms of overall security in Europe. And the fact that he has said that shows that there is awareness at that level, that they know exactly what the source of the problem is, and they know what's happening. And that's a very good development that the Communist Party of China is using in its Digital Belt and Road Plan to deploy all of this 5G infrastructure all over Europe. I'm reliably informed that in Germany, the pressure has been applied, and this could explain Chancellor Merkel's position, but I'm reliably informed that Beijing has strongly suggested in a recent a set of trade meetings that, or at least the sidebars to those trade meetings, that if Huawei and ZTE, the 5G vendors backed by the Communist Party, if they do not get a minimum of 40% of the 5G network build in Germany, that there would be serious trade consequences for German exports to China. You can be pretty sure that that's targeting the German auto sector, and you can imagine that that's got the German industry lobbies, particularly the auto industry lobbies, very concerned. It is my understanding that the suggestion has been made in the very, very clear terms that if those Chinese vendors do not get a minimum of 40% of the German 5G build-outs, that there will be trade consequences for German exporters to China, and it rings true to me. I also know that there has been direct representations made to national leaders in some countries in Europe, where they've been asked, what are they thinking? Why would they even contemplate a ban on Huawei, and that this will have ramifications for them in their relationships, investment and trading relationships with China, and a direct effort to try and split them from the US by suggesting that the US isn't serious in its advocations to about the threats of Huawei and that Huawei should be banned, that this is something that should not be taken seriously. I mean, it should be taken seriously because they mean it, and with very, very good reason. Beijing's envoys are messaging in meetings that this is an issue of paramount importance to them, even in meetings with leaders. This 5G issue is right near or at the top of the agenda, and that countries that are actively contemplating following the US and now President Macron's lead on this issue need to think long and hard about what they're doing, because if they do follow that lead, that there will be consequences for those countries, trade consequences and other consequences for those countries. And that the suggestion is being made in some of those meetings that the American resolve on this issue is not particularly strong. And I mean, it's misinformation, but it's very interesting to see how the Communist Party's establishment and foreign policy foreign affairs establishment is reacting now that they know that leaders such as President Macron and of course President Trump know exactly what they're doing. No, I don't believe Europe has passed a tipping point. I think President Macron has shown courageous leadership on this issue. He clearly grasps what's going on. A final decision has not yet been made in Germany. I expect that Boris Johnson will probably be the next Prime Minister of the UK after the general election in the UK. I think there will be serious focus on this issue immediately in the aftermath of the general election in the UK. And I think that decision in the UK just might not go the way that the mobile carriers and that Beijing think it's going to go. The fact that they have been so arrogant in taunting the US about the fact that their closest ally is going in the wrong direction on this, I think that was a miscalculation. I think it's particularly arrogant, and I think it's highlighted to people just how important this issue is. And I think that countries like Hungary, Poland, Italy are all rethinking the issues, and that's not even to get into what other countries in Europe are looking at doing. There's a new realization of the risks and the threats, and I think that it's quite possible that you will see Europe changing course on this. I think a lead from the US on this issue where we can define a new model. We've talked about before in previous interviews about the need for to break the model that Beijing has bet the farm on. And the way you break that model is by doing wholesale 5G networks, by dropping the average price of capacity. You drop the average price of capacity and the whole business model that Beijing has bet its digital Belt and Road on collapses. Mm-hmm. We're at a very, I'd say, a critical point, and a lot will be determined on that before the end of the year. There's a number of ways to do that. Of course, the bottom-up way is through social media and the regular media. I mean, there is more and more information that's becoming available. There are some excellent books that have been written on this subject and released this year. One in particular, that the most recent release, is a book by Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, of the House here in the US. Gingrich's book is called Trump versus China, and it's interesting insofar as that it very succinctly sets out the scale of the challenge, the historic nature of what's going on. He calls this one of the greatest strategic, maybe even the greatest strategic challenge that the American Republic has ever faced in its history. And he sets out what needs to be done to win it. And I have to say, having read the book, its analysis is brilliant, not surprising coming from a guy like Gingrich, and its recommendations are rock solid. They make complete sense to me. So reading a book like that, there are other books. There's the 100-Year Marathon by Pillsbury at the Hudson Institute. There is Stealth War by retired Brigadier General Rob Spalding and others. And I would say that also be very cautious about your sources of information. There are a lot of very well-heeled voices who have got enormous vested interests in the current status quo in China not changing. They like the Communist Party of China because they have a business relationship with them. And so I would discount those voices who are compromised and frankly in many cases bought because of that relationship, and listen more carefully to voices that perhaps are leveling with people and telling them the truth. But Gingrich's book, Trump versus China, is a good place to start. I think that it's very obvious if people look in the media. There are some household names in businesses that are out there de facto being apologists for the Communist Party of China. And those people have done extremely well out of a system won on the blood and commitment of previous generations of people in the United States and elsewhere in the West who have fought against tyranny. And those people fought for your freedom and allowed you the freedoms to prosper and create the wealth that you've had. Don't think that you should be able to deny it to people in China or anywhere else. You know, it's an interesting question. The caricature of what drove American and Western foreign policy was that it was big oil, that the oil companies drove Western foreign policy or tried to drive Western foreign policy. It's perhaps a much more accurate analogy to think about the fact that big tech and telecom is at least trying to drive Western foreign policy. And indeed, President Macron's comments, which we've already talked about, pointed to that fact. He said last week that governments have outsourced decision-making national security issues to these companies that have no national security role and don't care about these issues. If you only care about making money, if you are amoral in terms of your operations, of course, you're going to want to deal with whoever is in charge in China. And if that happens to be the Communist Party of China, then so be it. You want access to an enormous market that is growing. And if you can get access to that market, anything that might slow down your access to that market, like having to have any kind of moral policy, is going to get in your way. And, it's not a matter of speculating whether or not this is happening. It is happening. There's no question about it. We can see it in 5G and the companies that are deploying it ahead of their governments even being able to make decisions. We see it in the massive lobbying effort that's coming out of some parts of the tech industry to try and ignore all of the abuses, all of the concentration camps, exactly what's going on in Hong Kong, the build-up to potentially another Tiananmen Square, that we're supposed to ignore all of those and listen to big tech and its advocation that we should just carry on as usual with the Communist Party of China. These are not good advisors. There's no confusion about communism in places like Poland, for example, or in places in places that suffered under its yoke. Hong Kong knows exactly what it's facing because it's been adjacent to it. There are so many people that it swam to Hong Kong in the old days to flee communism. As I say, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But the fact that you've got some messianic business leaders who think that, because you've made a few $1 billion, that all of a sudden you've got all the answers to the problems of the world. You probably haven't. The gut instincts of the street and of democracies are true, and I would rather entrust my children's future to the voices of Western democracies than I would to some messianic billionaire who thinks that it's okay to do business with the Communist Party of China.